"You always play that last hymn so loud," said Mrs. Cobb. Turner shrugged. He figured maybe this was just the kind of moment when God wouldn't mind his stretching. "It sounds like a hymn that needs to be played loud." "It's a morbid hymn for funerals. No one plays a funeral hymn loud unless they want to wake the dead." "I suppose I wouldn't want to do that." "No, I suppose you wouldn't." She looked at Lizzie. "It never does to wake the dead." She leaned forward. "Come tomorrow at high tide again." "Yes, ma'am. How did you know it was high tide?" "You think an old lady doesn't know anything? I've followed the tide since before your father was just a glint in God's eyes. Today it came in at 2:40. Tomorrow it will be 1/2 the hour. Come then, and tell your friend here that she can come too if she wants, and that I never did think to. Well, tell her she can come. Now the both of you scat and leave an old lady in some peace." So they scattered out the back, Lizzie still dripping now and again. And when they came out from the kitchen and stood for a moment in the first sunlight of the day, Lizzie looked at Turner while he smiled back and waited for her to tell him how wonderful he had been, how fine his music was. And God's truth, that what she almost told him. But she caught herself just in time. "It got a whole lot better once you stopped singing," she said, and skipped out the yard and was gone. And Turner skipped across the front yard and through the picket gate. He waved to Mrs. Hurd, who grinned and waved back from her window, and then skipped down Parker Head as thunder came from far, far away. His feet threw up mud with each step, and he hardly cared that by the time he was back at the parsonage, he would be wetter and muddier than the parishioners of First Congregational felt their minister's son should be. That's how it was for the rest of the week. Day after day, the skies quilted over, and the houses of Phippsburg shivered and curdled together, and the rain spilled down onto leaves that hung brown and heavy with the wet. High tide came too late now, so each afternoon Turner waited for the bells of First Congregational to ring 3 times. Then he left the parsonage and sprinted to Mrs. Cobb's house, where Lizzie would be waiting and dripping inside the kitchen. Mrs. Cobb had started to leave the back door open for her. They would take their spots in the parlor, Turner at the organ, and Lizzie sitting with her legs bent beneath her on the floor, and Mrs. Cobb in her armchair. And Turner would wheeze the organ into life. He did not try to sing again, but Lizzie did. When Turner slipped into "Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel?" Lizzie began to tap her knee. By the end of the first verse, she was nodding. By the end of the second, she was humming, and by the end of the third, she was singing along. "I set my foot on the gospel ship, and the ship it began to sail. It landed me over on Canaan's shore, and I'll never come back any more." Turner, who hadn't known the words to the last verse, fretted that Mrs. Cobb might want to grab a hold of Canaan's shore. But when he looked at her, she wasn't holding a hand to her heart or even clenching the arms of her chair. Her head was laid back and her eyes turned to Lizzie, and she was listening to her sweet high voice as if it were the first spring day. After that, Lizzie always sang the hymns she knew, and Turner cut down on the high churchy tunes to accommodate her. She never spoke to Mrs. Cobb, though, and Mrs. Cobb never spoke to her. But Turner figured Mrs. Cobb leaving the back door open was enough.